In June 1861, 14 Birmingham gunmakers faced a problem that had nothing to do with motorcycles. There were no motorcycles. The men belonged to the Birmingham Small Arms Trade Association, part of a weapons industry built around workshops where skilled craftsmen produced firearms through specialized manual labor. That system had served Birmingham for generations. Then the British government began changing how guns were made. At the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, new machinery allowed components to be manufactured to standard dimensions. Instead of one craftsman fitting individual pieces together until a weapon worked, interchangeable parts could be produced in large quantities. For Birmingham's traditional gun trade, the threat was obvious. Machines could make weapons faster, they could make components more consistently, and they could reduce the dependence upon the very craftsmanship on which the 14 men had built their livelihoods. Their answer was not to resist the machinery. They joined together to buy it. On 7th of June 1861, they formed the Birmingham Small Arms Company Limited with the purpose of manufacturing guns by machine. A 25-acre site was acquired at Small Heath. A factory rose beside what became Armory Road. Inside it, techniques borrowed partly from American mass production and the government works at Enfield began replacing the scattered workshop methods of the old gun quarter. The 14 gunsmiths had created a company to protect themselves from industrial change. They could not know that firearms would eventually become only one part of it. BSA would manufacture bicycles, cars, machine tools, buses, military equipment and motorcycles. At its peak in the 1950s, the company would become the largest motorcycle producer in the world. BSA later claimed that roughly one motorcycle in every 4 sold globally carried its badge. Then, within little more than a decade, the advantage disappeared. Japanese manufacturers arrived with smoother engines, electric starters, cleaner factories and motorcycles requiring less attention from their owners. BSA possessed famous names, enormous factories and control of triumph. It still collapsed. The story of that collapse began with the same problem the 14 gunmakers had faced in 1861. Someone else had discovered a better way to manufacture. BSA's first years demonstrated how dangerous dependence upon one industry could be. Military contracts brought large orders, including an early contract for thousands of rifles intended for the Turkish government. Then, demand weakened. In the late 1870s, the Small Heath factory became so short of gunwork that production stopped for roughly a year. The machinery remained, the workforce remained. The company needed something else to manufacture. Bicycles offered an answer. The bicycle industry was expanding rapidly around Coventry and Birmingham. Its products required precision metalworking, bearings, tubes, chains and components that BSA's existing equipment could make. By the 1880s, the company was producing bicycle parts and complete machines. This was not simply diversification for its own sake. The bicycle taught British industry how to manufacture light vehicles in quantity. Factories learnt to produce frames. Engineers learnt about steering geometry, wheels and chains. Dealers emerged. Customers became comfortable buying personal mechanical transport. When the internal combustion engine became small enough to attach to 2 wheels, much of the industrial structure required for the motorcycle already existed. BSA experimented with a motorized bicycle in the early 20th century. Its first production motorcycle appeared in 1910. It was a relatively conventional machine, using a single-cylinder 4-stroke engine and belt drive. BSA did not need to present itself as an exotic new engineering company. Its 3 rifles stacked into the famous piled arms trademark already communicated something valuable: precision, metal, reliability. The motorcycle business grew. Then the First World War returned BSA to the industry that had created it. Small Heath became part of Britain's enormous wartime production system. Rifles, machine guns, bicycles and military motorcycles were required in quantities civilian markets could never match. BSA expanded its workforce and manufacturing capacity. The company that had diversified because peace threatened its gun business became enormous because war restored it. That cycle would repeat. When the war ended, military demand contracted again. BSA returned to civilian products with larger factories and engineering capability that needed to be kept occupied. Motorcycles became increasingly important. During the 1920s, Britain emerged as one of the centers of the global motorcycle industry. Roads were improving slowly. Cars remained beyond the means of many families. A motorcycle could provide personal mobility for a fraction of the cost. Workers rode them to factories. Tradesmen attached sidecars. Families used motorcycle combinations as practical transport. Sporting riders wanted increasingly powerful machines. BSA could serve almost all of them. Unlike a tiny specialist manufacturer, it possessed manufacturing scale. The company made many of its own components and controlled businesses across engineering and metal production. It could sell simple commuter motorcycles while developing larger machines for enthusiasts and competition. Scale made BSA formidable. It also encouraged a belief that the company could survive almost any mistake. One of BSA's worst racing episodes came in the 1921 Isle of Man Senior TT. The company entered a team. Every BSA failed to finish. Management withdrew from major road racing for years. But competition eventually returned through a machine that gave BSA one of the most famous names in motorcycling. On 30th of June 1937, former TT star Wal Handley rode a BSA Empire Star at Brooklands. Brooklands awarded a gold star to riders who completed a lap at more than 100 miles per hour. Handley did far better than merely crossing the threshold. His fastest lap exceeded 107 miles per hour. BSA turned the achievement into a model. The Gold Star. From 1938 onwards, the name became associated with performance, eventually appearing on some of Britain's most desirable single-cylinder motorcycles. The logic was simple. BSA could produce practical transport for enormous numbers of riders while allowing its fastest machines to build prestige. Then war returned. During the Second World War, BSA became one of Britain's most important industrial producers. Its Small Heath complex manufactured enormous quantities of weapons. BSA also produced the M20 motorcycle for the armed forces, a heavy side valve machine valued less for excitement than for durability. More than 100,000 M20s were built, making it one of the most numerous British military motorcycles of the war. The factory itself became a target. German bombings struck Small Heath repeatedly. In November 1940, one raid caused catastrophic damage and killed dozens of workers. Production continued. Buildings were repaired, operations dispersed, and employees returned to machines beneath a war in which the company's products were being used every day. When peace came in 1945, BSA once again possessed huge industrial capacity. And once again, it needed civilian products. One of the most important arrived from Germany. Before the war, DKW had developed the RT-125, a compact two-stroke motorcycle admired for its simplicity and efficient design. After Germany's defeat, the design became available to the victorious powers as part of the wider transfer of German industrial technology. Versions appeared in several countries. Harley-Davidson produced an American interpretation. Soviet factories produced their own. The design also influenced Yamaha's first motorcycle. In Britain, it became the basis of the BSA Bantam. Introduced in 1948, the Bantam was small, economical, and far removed from the glamorous Gold Star. That was why it mattered. Post-war Britain needed cheap transport. A worker who could not afford a car might afford a Bantam. It could carry someone to a factory every morning, use little fuel, and be repaired without specialized equipment. Hundreds of thousands were built across more than 2 decades. BSA was now selling motorcycles at both ends of the emotional spectrum. The Bantam was a tool. The Gold Star was an aspiration. Then, BSA bought another company whose motorcycles could provide something different again. Triumph. Triumph Engineering had created some of the most important British motorcycles of the 20th century. Under designer Edward Turner, its Speed Twin had helped establish the parallel twin engine as a defining form of British motorcycling. Triumph motorcycles were lighter and often appeared more fashionable than many BSA products. They sold particularly well in the United States. In 1951, BSA acquired Triumph. The purchase transformed the scale of the group. BSA already controlled other motorcycle interests. With Triumph included, it became the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. The 14 Birmingham gunmakers had begun by trying to keep government firearms contracts. 90 years later, the company they created controlled an international motorcycle empire. And if you enjoy discovering the people, risks and forgotten decisions behind Britain's most influential companies, subscribe to the British Blueprint. And for those watching on television, it's the simplest way to make sure these stories are easy to find again. The 1950s appeared to justify BSA's confidence. Motorcycles carrying BSA and Triumph badges were exported around the world. America became especially important. There, a motorcycle was increasingly becoming something different from basic transportation. Cars were relatively affordable. The motorcycle could therefore be sold as recreation, performance, and identity. British machines fitted that market beautifully. They were fast, they sounded distinctive, they carried the association of European competition. Triumph twins became especially desirable. BSA had the Gold Star, A-Series twins, and other successful models. American riders helped turn British motorcycles into cultural objects. The image eventually extended into films, racing, and youth culture. But beneath that success, the industry was becoming comfortable with an old way of building. British motorcycles demanded involvement from their owners. Oil leaks were tolerated, chains required adjustment, vibration was expected. Kickstarting was part of the ritual. Electrical systems could be temperamental. Fasteners loosened. For riders raised with those machines, maintenance was almost part of motorcycling itself. The danger was assuming future customers would accept the same relationship. Across the world, another motorcycle industry was learning from British success. Japan's manufacturers initially attracted limited respect in Britain. Their early motorcycles were often dismissed as small machines for domestic transport. But companies including Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki and Kawasaki were investing aggressively in manufacturing, engineering and quality control. Edward Turner saw some of it himself. After retiring from Triumph's senior management, he toured Japanese motorcycle factories in 1960. What he found should have been disturbing. Production was modern, volumes were enormous, companies were investing in new machinery, and their products were becoming more sophisticated at extraordinary speed. Honda demonstrated the change particularly clearly. Its small motorcycles were clean, quiet, and approachable. The Super Cub offered step-through convenience and simple operation to customers who might never have considered themselves traditional motorcyclists. Honda then moved upwards. The company raced internationally, proving that Japanese engineering could deliver performance as well as practicality. BSA and Triumph remained stronger in the large motorcycles Americans wanted. For a while, management could look at Japanese small bikes and believe they occupied a different market. That was the mistake. Honda was not choosing to remain small, it was climbing. BSA, meanwhile, contained a structural problem hidden inside its size. It owned competing brands. BSA and Triumph sometimes sold motorcycles aimed at similar buyers while maintaining separate factories, identities and engineering traditions. The acquisition had created market power. It had not automatically created efficient integration. Triumph operated at Meriden near Coventry. BSA remained centered at Small Heath. Engineers could develop similar ideas separately. Managers worried that changes might damage one badge in order to strengthen another. Dealers in important export markets had their own preferences. The group possessed scale without always receiving the advantages of scale. One project demonstrated this painfully. During the early 1960s, Triumph engineers Bert Hopwood and Doug Healey explored a new three-cylinder engine. The idea was logical. British parallel twins were approaching the practical limits of displacement. Increasing engine size produced more vibration. Three smaller cylinders could produce greater power more smoothly. A working prototype existed by the middle of the decade. Had BSA Triumph moved quickly, it could have launched an advanced large-capacity multi-cylinder motorcycle while Japanese manufacturers were still associated principally with smaller machines. It did not. Development slowed. Styling decisions consumed time. The group planned versions for both brands. Ogle Design produced a dramatic new appearance that divided opinion, including among the American distributors whose market mattered most. The motorcycles finally arrived in 1968 as the Triumph Trident and BSA Rocket 3. Mechanically, they were impressive. The 750cc triple was powerful, smooth by contemporary British standards, and capable of serious high-speed performance. For a brief moment, BSA Triumph still had one of the fastest production motorcycles available. Then Honda unveiled the CB750. The comparison was devastating. Honda's motorcycle used an inline four-cylinder engine. It had a front disc brake. It was smooth. It was reliable. It could be started electrically. Its appearance looked modern, and it was produced by a company capable of delivering consistent motorcycles in huge quantities. The BSA and Triumph triples were not bad machines. They had simply arrived into a market whose standards had changed while Britain was preparing them. The Japanese threat was no longer theoretical. A rider could walk into a dealership and compare the products directly. British motorcycles often still offered excellent handling and character. Japanese motorcycles increasingly offered the owner something more important: confidence. Turn the key, press the starter, ride. The difference reached deeper than features. Japanese manufacturing methods produced consistency. A motorcycle arriving at one dealer was much more likely to behave like the motorcycle tested by the magazine. British manufacturers continued depending heavily upon production systems that required more fitting, adjustment, and correction. Quality could vary. Labor relations complicated change. Parts, shortages interrupted assembly. Old factories constrained efficient production. These were not failures of individual British workers. Many employees possessed extraordinary skills. The problem was that the industry depended upon those skills to compensate for production systems competitors were designing, so that compensation was less necessary. BSA's enormous industrial history also became a burden. The group had interests extending far beyond motorcycles. Management had to allocate money between businesses with different requirements. The motorcycle division desperately needed investment in modern production, entirely new products, and better quality control. Instead, money was also spent on projects that offered little return. One became infamous: the Ariel 3. Ariel, another marque within the BSA group, introduced a three-wheeled 50cc machine intended to appeal to riders wanting stability and simplicity. Its articulated chassis allowed the front portion to lean while two rear wheels remained connected through a special system. The concept was unusual. Customers largely rejected it. Development and production losses have been estimated at around $2 million, a serious amount for a group already weakening. BSA could not afford many experiments like that. By the end of the 1960s, the American market that had sustained British large motorcycles was changing rapidly. Honda, Kawasaki, and Yamaha offered increasingly powerful machines. The Japanese manufacturers were not simply copying Britain. They were redefining what customers expected. Electric starters ceased to look luxurious. Oil-tight engines became expected. Reliable electrics became expected. 5-speed gearboxes and disc brakes became increasingly normal. BSA continued improving its machines, but improvement was taking place on aging foundations. The company introduced updated A-series twins and attempted to modernize styling for America. The Rocket 3 itself improved and achieved racing successes that demonstrated how capable its engineering could be. A heavily developed BSA triple won at Daytona in 1971 with Dick Mann. The victory should have been triumphant. Instead, it occurred while the company behind the motorcycle was approaching financial disaster. By 1971, the BSA Group recorded a trading loss of approximately $3 million. Management attempted another rescue. The motorcycle range was heavily revised for the 1971 model year. New frames were introduced for major BSA and Triumph twins, intended to rationalize production around shared components. The concept made financial sense. Execution became disastrous. The new oil-bearing frame placed engine oil inside the frame tubes, reducing the need for a separate oil tank and offering opportunities for common production. But the frame created packaging problems. On some models, the seat height became uncomfortably high. More seriously, the redesigned machines reached production late. British manufacturers depended heavily on selling motorcycles into America at the right point in the season. Miss that window and unsold machines consumed cash for months. BSA missed it. The group was now trapped. Sales were falling. New products required investment. Factories required modernization. Dealers were losing confidence. Banks could see the same numbers. In 1971, financial support arranged through Barclays helped keep the group operating. Restructuring followed. Jobs disappeared. Assets were sold. Motorcycle production was reorganized between Small Heath and Meriden. But each reduction made another question harder to avoid. What exactly was BSA saving? The BSA badge had once been among the most recognizable names in world motorcycling. Now Triumph possessed stronger attraction in several crucial markets. If the group could not support both brands, one might have to disappear. By 1972, bankruptcy was approaching. The British government became involved because the collapse threatened employment and one of the country's most visible export industries. A rescue was arranged around another troubled British motorcycle manufacturer, Norton Villiers, controlled by industrialist Dennis Poor through Manganese Bronze Holdings. The plan combined Norton with the motorcycle assets of BSA and Triumph. The new structure became Norton Villiers Triumph. The names suggested preservation. The financial logic demanded closures. Poor wanted to concentrate production and reduce a workforce the industry could no longer support. The BSA name effectively disappeared from mainstream motorcycle production. The factory at Small Heath ceased the role it had held for generations. 63 years of continuous BSA motorcycle production ended in 1973. The company, founded by 14 gunmakers, had survived the decline of handmade firearms by moving into machine production. It had survived collapses in weapons demand by moving into bicycles. It had survived 2 world wars. It had survived bombing. It had become the largest motorcycle manufacturer on Earth. It could not survive the industrial transition of the 1960s and 1970s. Even the government-backed consolidation failed to produce stability. When Norton Villiers Triumph announced plans to close Triumph's Meriden factory, workers resisted. They occupied the plant and eventually established a cooperative with government assistance. Triumph production continued there for several more years. Norton struggled on separately. The attempt to create one surviving British motorcycle group fragmented almost as soon as it began. It is tempting to explain BSA's destruction with one sentence. The Japanese arrived. That is incomplete. Japanese companies supplied the competitive pressure. BSA supplied many of the weaknesses that made the pressure fatal. The group had recognized multi-cylinder performance early enough to respond. Then it delayed the triple. It possessed famous brands. Then it allowed overlapping structures to dilute investment. It had extraordinary engineers. They worked inside factories that needed modernizing. It could produce motorcycles capable of winning races. It struggled to produce every customer's motorcycle with the same reliability. Management made poor investments. Product decisions reached the market too slowly. And the scale that had once protected BSA made rapid change more difficult. Labor conflict mattered too. But reducing the collapse to strikes repeats the same mistake as reducing it to Japanese competition. British motorcycle workers did not decide that Honda should have electric starters. They did not delay every major investment. They did not create the corporate structure combining multiple competing marques. Industrial relations were part of a failing system involving management, capital, factories, unions, and government. The entire structure was struggling to adapt. The irony sits at the beginning of the story. In 1861, 14 Birmingham gunmakers had understood perfectly what technological disruption looked like. Government factories were adopting machine production. Their traditional methods could not compete, so they pooled resources, created a larger company, and adopted the new system themselves. That decision saved them. A century later, BSA faced another manufacturing revolution. This time, it was the established giant. The challenger was building more efficiently. The challenger was investing aggressively. The challenger understood that customers would increasingly value ease of ownership as much as mechanical character. This time, BSA adapted too slowly. The name did not vanish completely. Rights to the BSA marques survived through various companies after the original group disintegrated. Decades later, the Indian Mahindra Group acquired control of the brand through its motorcycle interests and began developing a revival. The modern BSA Gold Star returned to British roads in the 2020s, using a famous Birmingham name within a very different international manufacturing structure. That revival carries another piece of historical irony. One of Britain's most celebrated motorcycle brands now depends upon investment from the very part of the world where modern motorcycle manufacturing has achieved enormous scale. The badge survived by becoming international. The original company had once tried to dominate the world from Small Heath. For more human stories behind the businesses, machines, and inventions that shaped Britain, subscribe to the British Blueprint. There are photographs of the old BSA factory at Small Heath filled with motorcycles. Rows of fuel tanks, engines waiting beside frames, workers standing at machines beneath the 3 rifles of the piled arms badge. For a period, enormous numbers of motorcycles leaving those buildings travelled to countries where the BSA initials alone suggested that Britain still understood how a motorcycle should be built. The 14 gunsmiths who created the company had done so because they feared becoming obsolete. Their solution worked for more than a century, but success changed BSA's position. The company that had once rushed towards new manufacturing methods became the company others were overtaking. It built guns, because guns were the future, then bicycles, then motorcycles. Eventually, the world changed once more, and this time, the biggest motorcycle company on Earth was the one that failed to change quickly enough.